the room where you don't belong. Have you ever walked into a room full of people and immediately felt like you didn't belong, not because of how you looked or what you wore, but because of how you think? While others laugh, trade small talk, and share surface-level ideas, you find yourself noticing the subtle inconsistencies in their logic, hearing the assumptions embedded in their language, feeling the gaps between what is said and what is meant. You see patterns where others see noise. You ask questions that stop conversations cold. And when you speak up, when you dare to challenge the status quo, you're met not with curiosity, but with discomfort. The air shifts. Eyes avert. And suddenly, you're the problem. Intelligence, we're told, is something to admire. Something that elevates, empowers, and enlightens. But reality tells a different story, one where those who think deeply are more often punished than praised. Why is it that the most insightful voices are so often the most silenced? This discomfort is not just social, it's existential. You begin to wonder if the way you see the world is flawed, if your tendency to question, analyze, and notice what others miss is more curse than gift. You try to connect, but your thoughts feel too dense, your words too heavy. You begin to hold back, to withdraw. And yet, your mind won't stop. You still see the contradictions. You still feel the questions pushing up from beneath the surface of every conversation. Eventually, you come to understand something painful but liberating. The world doesn't fear intelligence because it's rare, it fears it because it's disruptive. And disruption, even when it leads to truth, feels dangerous to those who've built their identity on comfort. You are not broken. You are simply awake in a room that has chosen to stay asleep. 2. The false narrative of admiration. We grow up being told that intelligence is a gift, a strength that leads to admiration, success, and influence. We see awards given to top students, statues built for great thinkers, books filled with the ideas of those who challenge the world. But beneath this cultural script lies a contradiction, because the moment intelligence starts to question the foundations of that very culture, it stops being celebrated and starts being contained. The myth that we admire intelligence only holds when it fits within safe boundaries, when it entertains but doesn't provoke, when it affirms rather than questions. The moment it asks too much, moves too fast, or sees too far, it becomes something else entirely, a threat. Look back through history, and the pattern is unmistakable. Socrates was executed not for harming anyone, but for asking questions that made others uncomfortable. Galileo was forced to recant truths that contradicted religious dogma. Nietzsche's work was ignored during his life, misused after his death. And Schopenhauer, the very voice behind this inquiry, lived in isolation, his brilliance dismissed as pessimism. These men weren't punished for being wrong. They were punished for being right too soon. Society doesn't hate intelligence because it's arrogant. It fears it because it sees what others deny. To manage this fear, we reduce the intelligent to caricatures: the awkward nerd, the cynical professor, the out-of-touch genius. These images aren't harmless jokes. They're cultural tools designed to keep intelligence at bay, to make people laugh instead of listen. And in doing so, society sends a message: think, but not too deeply. Ask, but not too much. Be smart, but not so smart that you make others feel small. What we call admiration is often camouflage, a mask worn over quiet resentment, a trophy handed out to keep true brilliance from asking uncomfortable questions. Because behind every applause is an unspoken warning: stay in line. 3. At the heart of society's resistance to intelligence lies a quiet but relentless tension, the tension between comfort and truth. Most people don't seek truth. They seek stability, predictability, reassurance. And truth, by its very nature, does not always offer these things. It disrupts. It complicates. It pulls apart the narratives that help people feel safe in an uncertain world. Intelligence, therefore, becomes the force that threatens emotional equilibrium. It sees through the polished surfaces, questions the foundations of belief systems, and shines a harsh light on what others would rather keep in shadow. Schopenhauer believed that humans are not governed by reason. People don't avoid truth because they're incapable of understanding it. They avoid it because they're trying to avoid pain. The truth is rarely gentle. It confronts us with our limitations, our contradictions, and our ignorance. It forces us to let go of comforting lies about ourselves, about our society, about the world we think we know. And in doing so, it asks something enormous of us, the courage to live without illusion. That's why people flinch when you say something honest. That's why they dismiss your questions or change the subject when you challenge widely accepted ideas. It's not because you're wrong. It's because you've threatened the fragile scaffolding that holds their mental world together. In this way, intelligence becomes socially destabilizing. It's not just another opinion in the room. It's the silent challenge to the unspoken agreement. Let's not go too deep. Those who violate this agreement, who press into uncomfortable insights, are often labeled as negative, arrogant, or out of touch. Not because they've caused harm, but because they've disrupted harmony. The tragedy is that society doesn't distinguish between the chaos caused by truth and the chaos caused by malice. Both feel threatening. Both demand a response. And often, the response is rejection. Intelligence, then, becomes the unwanted guest, the one who sees too much, says too much, and refuses to pretend. 4. Society's immune system. Suppressing thought society, much like a living organism, has an immune system. And just as the body attacks what it doesn't recognize, society too attacks what it perceives as foreign, even if that thing is insight. Intelligence, especially when it is critical, nuanced, and unflinching, often functions as an antigen. It introduces unfamiliar perspectives, disrupts established beliefs, and threatens the cohesion that holds the group together. And the collective, sensing this disturbance, responds with rejection, not because it is evil, but because it is trying to survive. Culture thrives on consensus. Social bonds are formed through shared beliefs, unspoken agreements, and mutually accepted stories. These stories create identity, foster belonging, and provide meaning. But intelligence sees the holes in those stories. It notices the contradictions, the myths, the selective memories. It dares to ask, what if we're wrong? And in doing so, it destabilizes not just individual opinions, but the glue of collective identity. Schopenhauer argued that most people are not seekers of truth, but defenders of comfort. And so, when intelligence challenges what is known, it is met not with open minds, but closed ranks. Society does not debate with intelligence. It immunizes itself against it. This can happen in ways both subtle and brutal. In social circles, the intelligent are quietly excluded, dismissed as too much. In institutions, they are sidelined, labeled as non-team players. In media, they are caricatured, turned into reclusive eccentrics or arrogant elites. These are not coincidences. They are defense mechanisms. They exist to protect the group from the destabilizing effects of truth. And the result is tragic. The very people capable of seeing what others miss are systematically silenced. Not because they're dangerous, but because they are inconvenient, because they threaten to wake the dreamers. In this way, society does not just ignore intelligence. It suppresses it. And like any organism that attacks its own immune response, the system begins to rot from within. 5. The psychological burden of seeing clearly to see clearly is a gift but also a wound. Intelligence is often imagined as a path to power, clarity, and freedom. But what few people understand is the weight that comes with it. The more deeply you see, the more clearly you recognize the patterns of suffering that others ignore. You notice how conversations loop in superficial cycles, how institutions repeat the same mistakes, how people cling to narratives that quietly destroy them. You begin to feel like you're watching the world from behind a pane of glass present, but unseen. And that glass becomes thicker the more you understand. Schopenhauer believed that suffering increases with consciousness, not because the world becomes worse, but because the veil is lifted. What once brought comfort now rings hollow. The stories you were told as a child no longer hold meaning. The traditions that once felt sacred now appear mechanical. You stop pretending to be moved by things you've already questioned 1,000 times. But that clarity comes at a cost. It separates you. It makes it difficult to connect, to relax, to simply be. While others laugh at the surface, you're drowning in depth. While they celebrate easy answers, you're tangled in unresolved questions. And because your pain doesn't come from failure, but from insight, it becomes difficult to explain. Who would understand that you're not sad because something went wrong, but because you see too much of what's wrong? Loneliness doesn't come from being alone. It comes from seeing what others can't, or worse, what they won't. You learn to speak less, to listen more, to carry your thoughts quietly. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you know how easily truth can be mistaken for judgment. And so, the intelligent retreat not into arrogance, but into caution. Not into superiority, but into silence. Because sometimes, the burden of seeing is not in what you understand. It's in realizing how few others are ready to see it with you. 6. The trade-off, ignorance, and peace. There is a strange peace that comes with not knowing. A kind of mental silence that shields people from the unbearable weight of understanding. Those who drift with the current of culture, who adopt the values handed to them without question, often seem more content. They laugh more easily, sleep more soundly, and move through life without the invisible burden that clings to the thinking mind. This is not an illusion. It is a trade-off. Schopenhauer saw it clearly. Ignorance, whether chosen or inherited, offers a kind of tranquility that intelligence rarely grants. The less you question, the less you suffer. Because suffering is not always caused by external events. Often, it is born from awareness, from the sharp realization that things are not as they seem, that people are not as kind as they claim, that the systems meant to protect us often exploit us. Intelligence opens the door to this reality. And once you step through, you cannot return. The trade-off becomes clear. You either live in comfort and illusion or in awareness and solitude. Most choose the former not out of cowardice, but out of instinct. It's easier to believe what you're told than to dismantle the story and rebuild it yourself. It's easier to participate in rituals than to ask why they exist. It's easier to nod along than to challenge authority. But for the intelligent, this choice often isn't a choice at all. Their mind won't allow it. Questions arise without permission. Patterns reveal themselves uninvited. They cannot unknow what they've come to see. And so, peace becomes elusive. Not because they don't desire it, but because they can't pretend. In this way, intelligence becomes a quiet exile, a condition where clarity costs connection, and where understanding the world means never being fully at home within it. And yet, despite this, they endure. Because deep down, they know peace built on illusion is never truly peace. And truth, no matter how painful, remains the only path to something real. 7. When intelligence threatens power does not fear violence. It can contain violence. It can crush rebellion, silence protest, and weaponize fear. But what power truly fears is intelligence, because intelligence questions the foundations on which power stands. It exposes the contradictions in the rules, the hypocrisy in the leaders, the illusions in the system. Intelligence does not storm the gates. It quietly removes the need for them. And that makes it dangerous in a way few things are. Schopenhauer understood this deeply. He saw that those in power do not resist intelligence out of ignorance, but out of self-preservation. Because intelligence does not just challenge what people believe, it threatens the very structure that maintains authority. When a thinker asks, "Why should we obey?" the entire mechanism of control begins to tremble. The history of suppression is the history of intelligence confronting power. Socrates was not killed for being clever. He was killed for teaching others to think for themselves. Galileo was not punished for looking through a telescope. He was punished for seeing something that the church could not allow to be seen. Every time intelligence has made a leap forward, power has tried to pull it back. Not always with force. Sometimes with ridicule. Sometimes with bureaucracy. Sometimes with silence. And this resistance is not irrational. Power depends on belief, on a shared narrative, on the sense that the system is stable and just. Intelligence threatens that narrative. It does not obey. It does not flatter. It does not stay silent to maintain appearances, and so it must be marginalized. Labeled as elitist, accused of arrogance, made irrelevant. The intelligent are often seen not as visionaries, but as troublemakers, not because they are wrong, but because they disturb the illusion that power depends on. In this light, society's treatment of intelligence is not an accident. It is a strategy, one designed to maintain order by eliminating the very minds that might elevate it. 8. The collapse of civilizations that silenced truth. Civilizations do not collapse in a single moment. They unravel slowly, invisibly, as if nothing is wrong until everything is. And if you trace the fall of great societies, you will find a common thread, not of violence or famine, but of willful ignorance. Not the absence of intelligence, but the suppression of it. The warnings were there. The thinkers spoke, but no one listened, because listening would have required change, and change would have threatened comfort. This is how civilizations die, not by accident, but by choice. By turning away from the minds that see clearly, by silencing the voices that question, by exiling those who refuse to pretend. The fall of Rome was not just a military failure. It was a cultural one. The scholars and philosophers were replaced by dogma and spectacle. The empire chose distraction over introspection, conformity over wisdom. The Enlightenment was born only after centuries of darkness, centuries in which thought was policed and inquiry punished. Even in modern times, the pattern continues. Societies resist reform until collapse is the only teacher they cannot ignore. Progress is not denied because it's wrong, but because it's inconvenient. Because it forces a reckoning with values, systems, and structures that feel too sacred to question. And so, the cycle repeats. The intelligent retreat. The systems calcify. The illusions deepen. Until eventually, reality breaks through, not with insight. The tragedy is not that intelligent voices go unheard. The tragedy is that they often speak just before it's too late. Schopenhauer believed that truth is not fragile, but societies are. The truth remains, whether we embrace it or not, whether we silence it or not. But the longer we deny it, the more violent its return becomes. When a civilization stops listening to its thinkers, it stops growing. And when it stops growing, it begins to rot. Not from without, but from within. Not because it couldn't be saved, but because it refused to understand what was trying to save it. 9. The two paths: solitude, or translation for the intelligent mind living in a world that resists depth. Two paths eventually appear. The first is solitude. The second is translation. Solitude is not bitterness. It is not the angry retreat of someone who failed to connect. It is the conscious decision to protect clarity in a world that distorts it. Many great thinkers found refuge here not because they hated people, but because they valued thought too much to dilute it for casual conversation. Schopenhauer believed that solitude was the natural habitat of intelligence, not because it was ideal, but because it was honest. In solitude, there is no need to simplify, no pressure to entertain, no expectation to conform. Your thoughts can grow without interruption. Your questions can deepen without judgment. It is not an escape. It is a sanctuary. And yet, solitude carries its own weight. The absence of misunderstanding is also the absence of connection. The price of being fully yourself is being mostly alone. That is why some choose the second path: translation. Not in the literal sense, but in the emotional one. They become bridges. They learn how to carry deep insight into shallow waters without losing its essence. They speak in ways others can hear, not by diluting the truth, but by revealing it gently, slowly, with patience. They are not manipulators. They are interpreters, translators of reality. These are the rare minds who change culture not by fighting it head-on, but by guiding it inward. They know when to speak and when to wait, when to challenge and when to listen. And in doing so, they plant seeds in minds that may one day be ready to grow. Whether you choose solitude or translation is not a question of right or wrong. It is a question of temperament, of timing, of how much you are willing to give and how much you need to keep. But know this, both paths require strength, and both, in their own way, serve truth. 10. The responsibility of intelligence to see clearly is not only a burden, it is a responsibility. Intelligence is not about superiority. It is about stewardship, about carrying a light that others may not yet be ready to hold. The temptation, after years of misunderstanding and rejection, is to retreat, to go silent, to convince yourself that if the world doesn't want truth, you will no longer offer it. But the world doesn't resist intelligence because it is useless. It resists because it is powerful. And power, when carried without ego, becomes service. The intelligent are not here to dominate. They are here to remind humanity of what lies beyond instinct. You do not need a platform to make an impact. You do not need recognition to carry truth. Every conversation is a choice. Every silence, a signal. Every thought you refine in solitude becomes a tool for clarity, not just for yourself, but for the rare moments when someone is ready to listen. The future does not belong to those who shout the loudest. It belongs to those who see the furthest and still choose to speak with care. So if you are one of those who feels misplaced in the noise of modern life, who sees too much and connects too little, know this. You are not alone. You are not wrong. You are simply ahead. The world may not understand you now, but it will need you later. And when it does, your task is not to say, "I told you so," but to say, "I've been waiting." Because the deepest work of intelligence is not in being right, it is in being ready. And when the time comes, those who have stayed awake will be the ones to help others awaken too. If this message resonated with you, if you've ever felt the burden of thinking deeply in a world that pushes you to stay shallow, consider sharing this video with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell us, how have you navigated life as someone who sees more than most? And if you haven't yet, subscribe and join us. This space is for minds like yours.